to need the handouts that I gave you last week, posted last week. So if you brought them with you, bring them again. Otherwise, they are there. Don't forget about that. Quiz over what we did last week, and then what we're going to do this week, finishing up dissections. Ecology. Scientific study of the interactions between organisms and their environments. It's all about how organisms interact with their environments, what they need from their environments to survive, what they give to their environments to help keep everything balanced, how they interact with each other. So this is what we're going to be talking about throughout these next several chapters. We're going to talk about the role of humans as far as interactions go. So ecology, scientific study of the interactions between organisms and their environments. I'll never ask you to define ecology, but I figure since we're talking about it, it might be useful to know what it is. What we're going to do is go through the hierarchy of interactions. And we're going to start with the basic unit and build upon that. Something kind of like what we did with anatomy and physiology. We talked about the cell. Cells together make up a tissue. Tissues together make up organs. The organs together make up organ systems. And so we're going to do the same thing leading up to the organism. We did before, but in this case we start with the organism and build upon that. The organism is a basic unit of ecological systems. We talked about the cell being the basic unit of any individual plant or animal. We talked about how population is the basic unit of evolution. In ecology, the basic unit is the organism, the one, the individual. And as you can see, highlighted by the rectangle around the one hole. How evolutionary adaptations enable organisms to meet challenges which they confront in their environment. We talked about evolution, we talked about survival of the fittest, we talked about just day-to-day struggle, trying to get through. Maybe it's not so much hand-to-hand, claw-to-claw through combat. That's the case of the elephants. Maybe it's more than that. Maybe it's just trying to find enough food to get through each day. Maybe it's finding mates so you can pass on your genes. This is what we're talking about, how evolution allows them to adapt to their environments. The population, all the elephants in this case, the herd of elephants, is a group of individuals of the same species living in the same place at the same time. We could talk about that herd of elephants. We could talk about all the coyotes in Coachella Valley. We could talk about you being in this class at this one time being the student population for this course. And we'll talk about how population density and growth impact the environment. How some organisms do great in large numbers, others prefer to be more solitary. Now, we've had this definition before when we talked about evolution, so you should know it. It's nothing new. Group of individuals of the same species living in the same place at the same time. Community consists of all organisms that inhabit a particular area, assemblage of populations of different species. You can see in this one little vignette of a day in the life of the African savanna, you've got your population of elephants, and they're having to fight off a population of hyenas, a pack of hyenas. So I've got interactions between populations of two different species. Not to mention, you've got all the vegetation around. Don't just think animals, think plants too. But you've got the trees that the elephants might be browsing on. You've got the grasses that the hyenas might be using to cover their approach. A little bit of camouflage. How interactions between species affect community structure and function. When we talk about communities, we're talking about all the living organisms within the area. So whether it be plant, animal, whatever the case might be. I don't think a hyena could take down a full-grown adult elephant. Chances are there's a baby somewhere in there that they're after. That's it in the background, or if it's farther in the midst of the herd. The ecosystem, building upon things now. Think of it like an upside-down pyramid, the organism being at the bottom. And then you go with the population, then the community, now the ecosystem keeps getting bigger and bigger. It's like an upside down pyramid. Includes all biotic and abiotic factors within a specific area. If we're talking about something being biotic, what do you think that refers to? Something living. Now if you put an A in front of the word, you negate the meaning of the word. So abiotic would mean what? Non-living. So when we look at the ecosystem, we're not just looking at the living organisms, we're looking at the other stuff too. How energy flow and chemical cycling affects the various biotic and abiotic factors. Again, if it's all in italics, you don't need to worry about that. I just throw it up there to kind of help you put everything into its proper place. So you look at this, we're not just looking at the herd of elephants and the grasses and trees behind them, whatever other animals might be lurking there. They've got water in their environment. They've got clouds in the sky, so maybe they had some rain. It might be cooler there this time of the year, so you've got climate, you've got all these things coming together that define an ecosystem.
Does the weather define the ecosystem?
Yes.
Yes.
Big time. So biotic factors, living components found within an ecosystem. Abiotic factors, non-living components found within an ecosystem. If you look at this, you see the tree there, that's a living component. If you look at the soil, it's broken, it's cracked, it hasn't seen water for a while. There's clouds in the sky, but obviously those aren't rain clouds, at least not yet. So in this one picture, you get a feeling of heat, of dryness, and very few living organisms, mostly grasses and things. Looks like most of the animals have moved on. So the biotic and abiotic factors kind of paint this picture for you of what makes up the ecosystem and how it dictates who survives, who doesn't. Or how they survive, if they do. So what are abiotic factors? Well, they could be things like sunlight. Out here in the desert, you gotta watch. Even if you go to like Lowe's or Home Depot or some nursery and you find a plant that's a full sunlight plant and you plant it out in the sunlight, it might not be full desert sunlight and you could bake the plant. Gotta be careful with that. Water. Are we talking about water running through an ecosystem, as in this case with these waterfalls leading down to a creek or a stream that might eventually lead to a lake or a river? Or are we talking about how much precipitation the environment is? And that does dictate what different types of environments exist. Temperature, again, between water, temperature, specifically precipitation and temperature, these are two of the biggest factors that define an ecosystem. Wind. We've been dealing with this a lot lately. It seems like it's been a little bit worse this year. This tree isn't being blown over at the moment. It's growing that way. It's called flagging, where you just kind of say, okay, I give up. I'm going to grow into the wind in order to survive. Some ecosystems, like ours at this time of the year, have to deal with a lot of wind. We get gusts 50, 60 miles per hour. That doesn't seem so bad. You have blows a lot of sand around. It doesn't devastate the area. But if you go back east and you get gusts of 50 to 60 miles per hour, you get a lot of damage because those environments just aren't accustomed to dealing with those types of winds. And then rocks and soil. If you have a lot of rocks and a very sandy soil, you don't see a lot of vegetation here. But if you get the right kind of soil with the right kind of nutrients in it, you can have all kinds of vegetation. And then the last thing, the biggest part of this, starting with organisms, populations, communities, ecosystems, the biggest thing is the biosphere. We're talking about the global ecosystem, Earth itself. So all the planet's ecosystems, life where it lives. That is the biosphere, living planet. Red kangaroo distribution in Australia is dependent upon the amount of moisture in the environment as well as the climate. It says here, red kangaroos occur in most semi-arid and arid regions in the interior where precipitation is relatively low and available from year to year. Southern Australia has a wet, cool climate. Too wet, too cold for the red kangaroo, so you don't see any down here. And it shows you limits of distribution, how many kangaroos per kilometer squared, less than 1 in the white areas, and as it darkens, you get more. Climate in northern Australia is hot and wet with seasonal drought. They don't like that either. Southern Australia has cool, moist winters and warm, dry summers. In Tasmania, well, like I said, just don't swim out here. But you see, because of the climate, because of the temperature and the moisture, which you were asking about, Amy, all this has to do with animal distribution, as well as plants. Yeah.
Are there any kangaroos around here? Any zoo?
Any zoo? I don't know why they don't have more in zoos. No, I can't think of any. They might like have 1 or 2 at the San Diego Zoo, but not many. But even like deer, well, it's just about anything. These are like animals, they have koalas in there. These are eucalyptus, but there are lots of koalas in San Diego Zoo. They do have tree kangaroos down there. And wallabies, like big red or gray kangaroos now. I don't know why.
I think they have them in the San Francisco Zoo.
Okay.
I don't
So
know.
there's some Europe, some Bay Area.
What about the Lime Desert?
Stay away from the tiger.
You're getting a line.
Dispersal.
Oh, nice.
Movement of individuals away from their area of origin or from centers of high population density. The rock dove, the actual name of a pigeon. Rock doves were originally distributed throughout the dark red areas around the Mediterranean, northern Africa, southern Europe, parts of the Middle East, Asia, and eventually they made their way into Europe. Well, you can see, well, maybe they just moved up there. They just flew up there. Maybe climate changed, warmed Europe a little bit, and they felt comfortable up there. But how do they get from here to here? I said it before. When people came to the Americas, it was like a whole new ballgame. And it didn't matter what your social status was in Europe. You got to start over here. And so people brought things like pigeons with them. You think, okay. Because in Europe, people who collected pigeons, who raised and bred pigeons, that was the higher ranks of society. So if you brought pigeons over here with you, you were all of a sudden a high society. The problem was, they didn't stay. Pigeons didn't stay with the people. Maybe it was a storm or something like that, and then the pigeon coop was destroyed. The pigeons flew out and now joined wild populations. So as you can see by the light red, they're pretty much almost on every continent, of course. They don't show Antarctica. I'm guessing they're not there. Now, there's another way animals get from point A to point B. Sometimes it's by humans, other times it's not. Natural range distribution, organisms reaching an area on their own in which they previously did not exist. Cattle egrets. We see them out in this area all the time. We'll talk more about them later. They've got a nice relationship going on with livestock, whether it's domestic or wild. Cattle egret distribution, after originating in Africa, Europe, and Asia, spreading into North and South America. It's kind of cool because they show you. About 1951, they hit the northern tip of South, 1943 over here, 37 over here, okay. They moved from Africa this way, 1937, 43, 51, 56, they went south, 58 north, 61, they're still spreading north, 1970, they pretty much make the entire west coast of South America, and they keep spreading up into North America. They've reached all the way up to about the Canadian North American border. And they've done it on their own. Migration, somehow they were able to migrate all the way from Africa over to South America. Maybe there were some good winds. Maybe it was a storm that blew them way off course. They've settled over here and they've done quite nicely. So that's natural range distribution. They do it on their own. Species transplant. This is usually never a good thing. Intentional accidental release of species into areas where they were previously absent. Now, to trick the species transplant, for it to be considered a true transplant, the species must survive and reproduce. It's like transplanting an organ. It's not a real transplant, the body rejects the organ. It's not a real transplant, the environment rejects the species. But if the species survives, and the big key to everything in biology, if they can reproduce, then it's a true species transplant. Usually they tend to be detrimental to Institute for Native Species. We'll talk more about this in this segment too. Lots of cases where people are just stupid. The quagga and zebra mussels. How many have ever heard of the zebra mussel?
Yes, we do.
Okay. It's this guy right here with the stripes. Makes sense, the zebra mussel. Came over to this country in the ballast of ships from Eastern Europe. They pick up the water over there with the zebra mussels in them. They come over here. They release the water out of the ballast with the zebra mussels in it. Now it's in our waters. And you can see the zebra mussel sightings in the yellow. And it looks like it's pretty sporadic all over the place. Well, they're following waterways because it's an aquatic species. Here's what happens, or here's how it spreads. Let's say you go to the lake one week and you put the boat in the water, had a good time there. Next weekend you're going to go to the river. So you take the boat out of the lake, take it over the river, put it in the river. They can survive from like 1 week to the next and then go into the river. Now you spread it from one source of water to another. The other thing is intentional accidental release. Detrimental to the environment. Okay, I've been walking along the banks of the Ohio River and seen native mussels about this big dead because they've got zebra mussels all over their shell. And they outcompete them for food. They're both filter feeders. But if you've got somebody right in front of you at the buffet and they're taking up all the food and you can't get around them to get it because there's just so many of them, then you're going to starve. And that's what happens with these guys. They outcompete because they out-filter feed them. And so the native species die. They are intentionally released because of their filter feeding. They do a really great job of cleaning water. And so divers will take them and throw them into a body of water, maybe a small lake or something. And they'll come back weeks, months later and find that the water's clear. Now when you go diving, they can see. But then they've wiped out all the native species that were in that lake. So it's a real catch-22. The quagga, if you notice, the zebra mussel, you're thinking, well, I live way out here, what do I have to worry about that? You've got to worry about the quagga. Look where it is. Southern California. Ouch. And we live in the desert. I know, way to state the obvious. But we get some of our water from outside the desert, and these guys like water, and it's nothing for them to clog pipes, water treatment facilities, anything like that. And what you have to do is shut everything down, clean it out, and then you're ready to go again. Can we afford to have everything shut down for any length of time? Maybe. What's a quagga? And don't say a mussel. It's named after something else. Anybody know what the quagga was?
Indians?
What?
Sounds like Indians.
It's not Indian. It's an extinct equine species related to the zebra. It's half striped, half solid. Half striped, half solid. So actually a little bit of creativity went in the naming that. We've got the zebra mussel, that was no brainer. Hey, let's call this one the quagga. What? Turned out pretty cool. Because of fog water lines?
No, because of
Yes. California is pretty strict about what exotic species you can and cannot have because pretty much most of the state is ideal habitat. Florida needs to get with it and figure that out because they have so many introduced species problems down there right now. We have some. It's just that a lot of the stuff, and we'll talk about this later, you're just not aware that it's introduced species because it's been here for so long. We'll talk about that. Behavior. Preferences that may limit a species' ability to disperse into other habitats. Sometimes everybody's happy where they are, they don't want to move out. And by happy where they are, their preferences, their particulars, their likes and dislikes might be so specific that they don't want to go anywhere else. They can't go anywhere else. For instance, dietary preferences of certain species limit their ability to habitats where their food is found. The koala bear loves eucalyptus. And eucalyptus is limited to certain areas of Australia. Problem. Australia, much like the U.S., is developing areas for people to live. Cutting down trees and paving over areas where they can put up malls, strip malls, shopping malls, gated communities, all the kind of stuff like that. And, well, as the eucalyptus goes, so goes the koala. So sometimes you can be too well adapted to your environment that you're not capable of trying anything else. So eucalyptus is all pretty much and there are lots of koala bears at San Diego Zoo, like they're one of their mascots. Long-term prevailing weather conditions in a particular area. Major components of climate, the first two, the big ones, temperature and precipitation. Also, the amount of sunlight and wind can also dictate the climate. Desert Taurus does very nicely out here. We'll talk more about them later. Climate, long-term prevailing weather conditions in a particular area. Major components of climate, temperature, precipitation. Now, when we say precipitation, just don't think rainfall. I know it's hard to get your mind around it, but snows like frozen rain. That counts as precipitation. Sometimes fog and it's enough counts as precipitation. Basically, any kind of moisture from the sky is counted as precipitation. And of course, sunlight and wind. The first two are the big ones, though. They dictate most climate. Temperature, precipitation, sunlight, and wind. Towards the end of this chapter, I'm going to talk about 6 very specific different climates. And one of the things I'm going to tell you is the general temperature, the amount of precipitation they get every year. Because that's really and truly what defines climate. We've got a couple of different climates, macro and microclimates. Macroclimate, climate patterns in local, regional, and global level. Determined by input of solar energy and planets' movement in space. That drives a lot of our weather systems. The sun's warming effects on the planet result in temperature variations, air movement cycles, and water evaporation. Now, the whole idea of like global warming, which again we'll talk about later. What's causing it? Of course, we don't call it global warming anymore. The politically correct term is climate change. What we're seeing is more material in the atmosphere, more carbon dioxide, more methane, things that are causing our planet to warm up. So why isn't that up here? Well, because it begins with the sun. That wouldn't matter if it wasn't trapping so much sunlight. So we're just going to start with this for right now. The prime principal factor that determines our climate. So determined by input of solar energy and planets movement in space. Sun's warming effects on planet result in temperature variations, air movement cycles, and water evaporation. Yes?
Why is it called climate change now?
I think one, because it's not as global warming, sounds a little more catastrophic, and I don't think the research is lending itself right now to being as catastrophic as it personally be.
Thank you.
Climate change sounds more moderate. We are seeing climate change. Is it going to be something that's long-term or short-term? We don't know. So that's why they shifted. Plus, there's been a lot of negative connotation with global warming. A lot of the research, a lot of the data wasn't as accurate as it should be. So that's why they shifted. So something like a hurricane would definitely affect a macroclimate. It doesn't affect one area. It could affect things throughout a large portion of the earth. Factors affecting microclimate. Okay, you should be familiar with this because you live right here. Okay? And you're thinking, wait, I don't see my house. In general. Okay? Proximity to geographical features, such as living close to an ocean and with having a mountain between you and the ocean. Affects local temperature and rainfall, influences species distribution. Okay, we get this. It's all because cool air flows in from the water, moderating temperatures near the shore. This is why we go to the beach in the summer, to get away from the heat, right? It's always cooler at the beach. As it moves up the mountain, air that encounters mountains flows upward, cools at higher altitudes, and releases water as rain and snow. As it moves over, now you've got clouds that are much drier. leeward side of the mountains, less moisture is left in the air reaching the leeward side, which therefore has little precipitation. This rain shadow can create a desert on the back side of the mountain range. Like I said, we live right over here on this side of the mountain. So, influence of species distribution. Plants are easy to understand because some plants require less intense sunlight, more moisture. You can see them, understand them thriving over here. The plants that thrive over here, that survive over here, they have to tolerate greater amounts of sunlight and less moisture. And animals. Animals, just like plants, have to be adapted to certain regions. Yes, you could have coyotes over here and you could have coyotes over here, but they have to develop behaviors to allow them to exist in two different habitats because of the amount of rainfall or lack thereof, because of the different types of food they can exploit and eat. So, proximity to geographical features affects local temperature and rainfall, influence of species distribution. Also affecting macroclimate is proximity to bodies of water. Ocean currents influence the climate along coast. Coastal climates tend to be more moist. And you can see it here. The red is the warm, the blue is the cool. Picks up warm air going from the equator up Asia into the northern area up here by Alaska, where it's going to pick up cooler air and bring it down here. This is why our coastal waters are usually a little more cooler. Every now and then they warm up. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. If you look at the East Coast, most of the water that hits the East Coast comes from the equator, so it's warmer on this side. So if you want warm water, go to Florida, the Gulf of Mexico. It's nice and warm. It's not chilly most of the year like it is here in California. And you can see colder water coming down from the north. Water that goes up towards the north cools. And then you see this belt of cold water current flowing right off the coast of Antarctica. And this is what drives the cooler water moving towards the equator. All this is important because not only does it affect water temperature, but it affects the terrestrial climate as well. In those areas near these currents, as well as the areas farther away from them. It all impacts, it all ties in together. One of the things that affects macroclimate is seasonal variation. We have 4 seasons. I know out here it doesn't seem like it. You think we just have 2, a cool summer and a hot summer. Other places they actually have spring, summer, winter, and fall. Axis of the Earth's rotation and revolution around the sun affects length of daylight, solar radiation, and temperatures. You can see that the Earth tilts on its axis. And as it revolves around the sun, it rotates in place. And depending upon this tilt will determine how much sunlight that area gets and at what time of the year it'll get it. You can see September, March, we are closest to the sun, our orbit is elliptical. So June, December, we're farther away from the sun. And it all has to do with the way we tilt as we revolve around the sun. It determines the seasons, basically. Think about it this way. You could be outside around here on a sunny day in December, and it doesn't feel nearly as hot or intense as if you're outside on a sunny day in July. Right? And it's all because of the way the Earth is leaning towards or away from the sun.
It's the angle of the sun coming at us.
Angle of the Earth.
I don't know.
Right.
The sunlight hits us at a different angle, which is not as intense.
Correct. Unusual occurrences in wind patterns and ocean currents could result in unusual weather patterns. We've got El Nino and La Nina. I'm not sure what they're saying about it yet, but I keep hearing a lot of talk about El Nino. El Nino is kind of cool because what it does is it warms the water coming up the coast. There have been summers that you could just go out into the ocean just a bathing suit. You didn't need like a wetsuit or anything like that because it's that warm. Fishermen love it because what it does is it drives species of fish from South America all the way up to the coastal waters off California, so they could stay home and fish for things they would never get to unless they go to South America. So it does affect things. And I think we're getting ready to approach El Nino. These patterns pop up every 5 to 10 years. So sometimes they're more severe, sometimes less severe.
When was the last one? Was it like 1990?
It's been since I've been out here.
1990 or
There's
something?
been one sooner than that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I can't remember.
Early 2000s, I think there was one.
Early 2000s? Okay.
So unusual occurrences in wind patterns and ocean currents could result in unusual weather patterns. Microclimate, and our little friends of Pillbug, and yes, I'm working on your papers. Find climate patterns experienced by a community of organisms. So this is just going to affect a small region, very, very small region. We're not talking about local or regional or global. We're talking about your backyard. Think about it that way. Factors affecting microclimate. Trees casting shade. There could be things that do very well in the shade of a tree. Think about moss growing on the north side. As long as the tree's there, the moss doesn't care what's going on in Central or South America as far as the weather patterns go. It doesn't care what's going on off the coast of California, the Pacific Ocean. Open areas exposed to sunlight. Low-lying areas collecting more moisture. And features such as large stones and logs. We talked about the pill bug. You guys are probably more knowledgeable about it than you ever wanted to be. You know that it doesn't like to dry out. The things like sunlight, high temperatures, dryness, it does not like. And so its random movement helps drive it towards finding some place that's more hospitable. Someplace cooler, moist, someplace where it can survive. It has its entire life dependent upon microclimates. As long as it can find a nice cool place in your backyard to hang out in, it'll be perfectly content. Not caring, again, what goes on in other lands or other waters. That's a microclimate. Global climate change. Increasing temperature and change in weather patterns around the planet due mostly to increasing carbon. Global climate change. Terrestrial temperature increases. Aquatic temperature increases. And then we see changes in precipitation patterns. For instance, let's say the oceans off the coast of Florida, the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean, warm up a couple of degrees. Well, what that could do as far as precipitation patterns go, not only heavier rainfall and more rain, it could result in more hurricanes. Not just more hurricanes, but more severe hurricanes. Because hurricanes get their energy from water. And the warmer the water is, the more energy they derive. So that's how warming aquatic temperatures could affect changes in precipitation patterns. The polar bear, pretty much the poster child for global climate change. Now, it's not so much that the polar bear could survive a change in climate. It's a mammal. It has a very well adapted nervous system to figure these things out. However, if he's dependent upon hunting on ice floes, specifically looking for seals or sea lions, and the ice is melting and this is all he's got left, he's not going to find too much there. One year when it was a little bit warmer out, the seals and sea lions couldn't find enough ice, so they had babies on the shore along the coastal region. The problem was, when the precipitation increased, and when some of the ice continued to melt, the water levels rose. Well, if you're sitting on a flow of ice like this, preferably a bigger flow, then that's going to rise to the water. But if you're on the beach doesn't rise, it gets flooded, and it wiped out all the pups. So they lost almost like a generation. Well, they can go out and have more pups. Yes, it's tragic. It was a bit of a hit to the population, but they can have more. What does that do to this guy who's dependent upon the pups, or dependent upon the mothers on the ice floes? So he loses food. So it could wipe out a generation of polar bears as well. So it impacts organisms that way. Again, more on this later. And actually, I think he's been the first organism listed as threatened or endangered based on climate change. And there'll be more to follow, trust me. The biome. Major terrestrial or aquatic life zone characterized by vegetation type and physical environment. What distinguishes biomes from ecosystems? Not a lot, they're almost synonymous. Where we take the earth and divide it up into different areas based on vegetation, physical environment like precipitation, temperature, things like that. told you, I'm going to give you about a half dozen biomes that I want you to be familiar with. And chances are I wouldn't ask that in the short answer part. So multiple choice, learn the characteristics, being able to figure out which one is A, B, C, or D. I'm not going to tell you which four I'm going to ask. You just have to learn all six. They're not difficult. I think you guys can figure it out. So biome, major, terrestrial, or aquatic life zone, characterized by vegetation type, physical environment. So the ones I'm going to give you will be terrestrial biome, but we will talk about aquatic biomes or life zones first. Why don't we take a break here? Be back here by 20 after. I'm sorry, 25 after. Back here by 25 after. As you can see on this map, if you look down towards the bottom, you've got a key here, the oceanic, pelagic, and citric zones. Benthic is bottom. Pelagic is more of the open ocean. And you see that most of the Earth is open ocean. Okay? Intertidal zones, you find those right up against land masses. Estuaries are areas where you have freshwater and saltwater mixing, so it's not as salty as the ocean, but it definitely has a greater salt content than the freshwater. Coral reefs, you find those pretty much right around the equator between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn. You don't find them much anywhere else. A few places maybe. Rivers are the blue lines in the middle of land masses, and lakes would be the solid blue areas. I'm going to talk about characteristics of marine biomes and characteristics of freshwater biomes. Like everything else I try and do, I set this up so it's easy for you to remember. Try and keep the facts, the numbers, the stats pretty much consistent from one area to the next. Marine biomes, they have about a 3% salt content. Doesn't sound like much, but that's what makes the ocean salty. Oceans cover 75% of the Earth's surface. So 3/4 of the Earth is covered by water, which always brings up that line from, I think it's Transformers 2. And they, why do they call it Earth? It's mostly covered by water. Why don't they just call it dirt, for that matter? Why do we call it that? Mostly water. In fact, local climate, including carbon cycles. The oceans have the potential to be a huge carbon sink, taking a lot of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere because of all the algae, all the planktonic life. And they could do that, sucking the carbon dioxide out, making the atmosphere a little bit cleaner, a little less thick, so we wouldn't have so much global warming. And they've even tried to contrive ways of making more algae in the ocean. But again, when you start tampering with nature, we don't know what we're doing most of the time, and we tend to screw things up more than help things out.
There's a lot of talk about Earth being in the right zone because, further away from the sun, too much.
Just the right distance from the sun.
Right, exactly. What about salinity? Is there a level of salinity that wouldn't be possible in the ocean's in 10% salinity?
We probably would have adapted. The Great Salt Lake, the Salton Sea are more salty than the ocean, and yet life still exists there. It might not be life like we know it, but it would definitely alter types of life on Earth. You've got to have water now. How salt content impacts the life that you have, as long as you have water, I don't know. Could it adapt to being saltier? Sure, it's possible. I think so. The Dead Sea, the Red Sea, that's too salty. Yeah, it's called the Dead Sea because nothing lives in it. Chances are there's some bacteria there, but that's about it. Yeah. Okay, stratification of marine biomes. I gave you this diagram in your outlines. And so what I did is I started labeling the parts, and you can guess where this is going. Yes, it could have on quiz or exam. I started at 12 o'clock up here, the intertidal zone that's right up against the beach. The neritic zone is where it is relatively shallow. The oceanic zone is where it's much deeper. You see the pelagic zone being out here where it's deeper as well. Aphotic, one of the abyssal zones, the deepest part of the ocean. The aphotic, again, you put an A in front of the word to indicate the meaning of the word. This is where light really doesn't penetrate very well. The photic is only about the first 200 meters, if that much, where you get any type of light penetration. Anything below that, not much light. And in the benthic zone, anything along the bottom. It doesn't have to be deep bottom, it can be shallow bottom, but if you live along the bottom, you are benthic. So now these areas, if I put something on here and have you label the parts, be able to label the different parts, ramifications of marine environment.
Professor Rosick, the benthic zone is the bottom,
Yes.
so that goes all the way up to the.
Doesn't matter if it's shallow or deep, benthic is always bottom.
The one to the abyss.
That would be the deepest part of the ocean, the abyss, the abyssal zone.
Does the pelagic zone go all the way to the bottom?
Yes. It's more open ocean. So away from the coast, wherever you've got pretty much anything from the surface to the bottom without any kind of rising or falling to give you shallower waters, then yes, pelagic. Characteristics of freshwater biomes. Freshwater biome, 0.1% salt content. 3% of Earth's water is fresh water, the other 97% being salt. Now, a lot of that is tied up in snow and ice in Antarctica and around the Arctic Circle. It's impacted by the speed of flow or moving versus still. If you've got a pond or a lake, it's going to have different characteristics as opposed to something like a stream, a creek, or a river. Usually, still water tends to be warmer and has less oxygen. Moving water tends to have more oxygen and it tends to be colder depending on the depth. And it also impacts terrestrial biomes, which is earlier, if you've got something with a body of water, be it a lake, or even a pond, a river, or a stream or creek, or if it's something near the ocean where you have access to water, at least water effects like humidity, precipitation, things like that, it's going to alter your biome. So it has a lot to do with precipitation, but it also has something to do with the water running through it, so to speak. Other characteristics of freshwater biomes, you get things like thermoclines. Narrow layer of abrupt temperature change, separating warmer upper layers from colder lower layers. You've probably experienced this before on cooler days, where you jump into a pool and the upper surface is warmer than the lower surface. And you can feel it goes pretty good at the top, and as you go down, it starts to get chillier. Or maybe you're swimming in the ocean and you feel pockets of cold in there. That's a bit of a thermocline going on. Okay, sometimes it's more significant than others. In the summertime, in something like a lake, the very bottom of the lake can be very cold. As you move up, as it gets closer to the surface, it'll warm up. But if you start swimming, you want to dive down, you're going to feel that cold water hit you. And it will be very abrupt.
Would that be because less light is hitting it underneath? Like,
That's what dictates the temperature. But what happens is, as the water gets colder, it gets denser, and it sinks to the bottom. And so that's what sets up your layers, because it layers itself based on the temperature. Warmer water is heavier, colder water is heavier, warmer water is lighter, so it floats to the surface. Now, if you get in there and start swimming around, you're just going to mix all of that up, and so even out the temperature. And then you have turnover. Semi-annual, usually spring and fall, mixing of water due to changing temperatures resulting in oxygen-rich waters descending and nutrient-rich waters ascending. So, in spring and fall, when the temperatures start to change, what happens is the oxygen-rich water that's closer to the surface goes down, and the nutrient-rich water at the bottom. Now, what's been happening throughout the year, organisms, plant, animal material, dies, it floats to the bottom, you have bacteria there breaking all this down, creating all these nutrients. And as the temperatures start to change, as the water temperature starts to change, it causes this shift, bringing up the nutrients from the bottom, sending the oxygen down to the bottom. And you see it in the bottom as well. Summer it stays relatively stable, winter it stays relatively stable. It's just too warm or too cold to do anything. But as the temperatures start to shift from the cold to the warm, and then again from the warm to the cold, what happens is the water starts turning. As the heavier water as it cools descends, as the water gets warm at the bottom and ascends, and it causes the oxygen to go down and the nutrients to come up. That's turnover. So, stratification of freshwater biomes. A little bit different, some similarities. Again, starting at about 12 o'clock, we've got the littoral zone, which is shallower, and the limnetic zone, which is deeper. Okay? Before, when we had the oceanic zone, it refers to oceans. Limnetic refers to freshwater. Limnology is the study of freshwater. The limnetic zone. So the pelagic, the aphotic, the benthic, that did not change. So actually, the only difference is you have fewer things to learn here, and you've got the littoral and limnetic zone, okay, instead of the neritic and oceanic. It's a real difference. I'm trying to sell you on the fact that it's not all that hard, okay? And I believe I included this diagram in the outline as well. Characteristics of aquatic biomes in general, communities, distribution of population of different species in both marine and freshwater, based on certain parameters. So we're taking the definition before that we had a community being different populations, different species together, and we're extending a little bit as to what determines what makes up a different kind of community in the water. Well, it could be depth of light penetration. How deep is the light going to go down? Well, you got to think the algae, anything that carries out photosynthesis has to stay close to the surface, within that 10, 20 meters, all the way down to maybe 200 meters. Anything below that, forget it. So they're carrying out photosynthesis, they're making food. So the herbivores in the ocean, maybe tiny microscopic protozoans, small fish, they're going to stay close to the surface, feeding on this algae. And then the bigger fish feed on the smaller fish. They're going to stay close to the surface. The bigger fish that feed on the bigger fish are going to stay up there as well. Distance from the surface. The farther you move out from shore, the less life you're going to run into. You get to some areas of the ocean, and it's almost like a big wasteland. There's just nothing there. And so distance from surface, distance from shore. Distance from surface has everything to do with light penetration, distance from shore and surface. The farther out you go, the deeper you go. The depth of water, it's all kind of like the same thing, it sounds like. All this has to factor in as to light penetration. And where light penetrates, there you have life, you have living organisms feeding on each other. It's not to say that in ocean depths or in areas that are devoid of life, there's no life there at all. You do have organisms that survive down there. They've figured out a different way to do it. Sometimes you'll find them in areas where instead of feeding off photosynthesis, they feed off chemicals carrying out chemosynthesis. Usually around cements or something like that, where minerals from the earth are being spewed up with some type of volcanic handicapped too. So you do find life in most of the ocean. Big open places in between areas, the middle of nowhere, yeah, you might not find life there. Next up, terrestrial biomes. We're going to be talking about a few of these. Let me just point out a couple of things. Equator. You're going to find a lot of stuff in and around the equator, mostly the tropical rainforests. Deserts, you're going to find south of the equator down to the Tropic of Cancer, north of the equator, Tropic of Capricorn, north of the equator, the Tropic of Cancer. You'll find other areas, if you look up, we have high mountains that have their own ecology, basically because of the altitude. So you see a lot of patterns repeating themselves, north and south of the equator. Characteristics of terrestrial biomes determined by climate, altitude, and latitude. Okay, climate we'll talk more about in a second. Altitude and latitude. How far north or south you are from the equator, I pointed out a few of those things. Altitude, take a look at the Mount San Jacinto over here. You go to the top of the trail, technically you're still in the desert, but you've just gone up about 8,000 to 10,000 feet. Now you're up there, you see different vegetation, you see big trees. You have a different climate up there. And then you also get different species of plants and animals up there. So it all changes just by going up 8,000 to 10,000 feet. Usually named for climate features or predominant living organisms, usually plants. We could talk about tropical rainforests. That's a climate feature. The desert, climate, more of a climate feature. Coniferous forests are named after conifers. That's a predominant plant. Also, terrestrial biomes can be affected by weather patterns, which should be consistent or inconsistent. That's what that N-consistent means. Affected by annual mean precipitation. How much rainfall do you get on an annual basis? Also affected by annual mean temperature. How much temperature, or what's your temperature on an annual basis? If you look at this, here we are right here. You see we've got among the higher temperatures, and you see we have among the least amount of precipitation. We're not the driest though. That belongs to the Arctic and Alpine tundra. You see the northern coniferous forest, like it a little bit wet, but they can deal with the little bit higher temperatures. Temperate grasslands are good for dry and warmer. Temperate broadleaf forests, like a little bit more moisture. And then the tropical rainforest, they get the most amount of rain and they have still relatively warm temperatures. So affected by weather patterns, which could be consistent or inconsistent, affected by annual mean precipitation, how much rainfall or snow they get, and affected by annual mean temperature, how hot or cold does it get throughout a typical year. Disturbance. This is actually technically another type of abiotic factor. The event that changes the community by removing organisms and altering resource availability. It could be human activities like logging is in this picture. You come down and you clear cut a forest, you're taking the plants out, you're displacing the animals, maybe killing some things in the process. It's going to impact that community, maybe changing it forever. Severe weather patterns. You think about lots of rain they're getting back east this year. No rain we're getting here lately. Hurricanes, tornadoes, how they impact. Natural disasters. You can put the hurricanes, tornadoes in there because they're pretty extreme. Think about things like wildfires. That's a natural disaster. Volcanic eruption is a natural disaster. When Mount St. Helens erupted back in the 80s, they said it would be decades before life could make it back in there. It was so devastating. Within a decade, life started to grow nature can fix itself. It can figure things out. It's made it through some of the worst things that this universe has had to throw at Earth. We talk about saving the planet. Yeah, we're not talking about saving the planet. No matter what we do to it, it will fix itself long after we're gone. Talk about saving the planet, talk about saving ourselves. Because the planet will be fine. Think about it. It survived the meteorites, it wiped out the dinosaurs, it survived a cataclysmic volcanic activity that wiped out a lot of animals 250 million years ago. It can survive anything. It's us that we need to be more worried about. The services are sometimes essential to the survival of the community, especially dominant plant and wildfires. For instance, ponderosa pines need fire every 5 to 10 years in order to reproduce. They need fire to pop open the seeds so they can plant them other places. So, why would a plant, especially a tree that has wood that you would burn, why would it need fire? Well, they also have chemical retardants within the plant that keep them from burning. At least not so severely. Problem is, under the category of something else we don't get about nature, anytime a wildfire hits, it was always the attitude, let's put it out, gotta put it out, gotta put it out. But what you're doing is not just preserving the area, but you're building up all this debris, this natural debris, leaves, wood, things like that needs to get burned out every now and then. Otherwise, if you let this continue to build up, what happens is when a wildfire hits, it burns too intensely because it's got too much fuel for the fire. And something like this has some chemical retardants to prevent it from burning. They're not enough. And it burns too intensely and wipes out the trees and their seeds. So, again, something else we really don't get. We're getting better at it still. We're not there yet. So, disturbances sometimes essential for the survival of the community, especially dominant plant wildfires. Categories of terrestrial biomes. I'm going to have this set up, A, B, C, D, the same way for each time as we go through. What I could do is give you the characteristics of a biome. You have to tell me which biome it is. For instance, predominant vegetation, a wide variety of plants, location, equatorial. Nobody else is going to be equatorial. There are others that are going to be warm, but look at the amount of rainfall. That's what makes it a tropical rain forest. 200 to 400 centimeters per year. That's a lot. Funny thing about tropical rainforests, people see all the different kinds of plants and animals that live there. They figure the soil must be very nutrient rich to support all that life. They go in, they cut down the tropical rainforest, they try and grow other things there. Things don't grow because the soil is relatively poor. Reason being is, in the rainforest, it's warm and humid. Recycling of nutrients is very, very rapid. Decomposers, the detritivores, work very quickly to take the things that are dead or dying and work them back to the ecosystem. All the nutrients are in the plants and the animals, not the soil. So you might have a good season or two, but after that, you're not going to be able to grow anything. So the focus here, location and rainfall, you're not going to find anything else around the equator like that with that much rain. Savannas. Predominant vegetation, grasses, scattered trees. It's like a park where you have mostly grass and then every now and then a tree will pop up. It's not like a forest, not even like a woods. It's more like just scattered trees. Location, equatorial to the Tropic of Capricorn. Temperature warm, rainfall considerably less, 30 to 50 centimeters per year. Now, I'm only giving you 6. There's probably 4 to 6 more that I could give you. Some of them are pretty particular, pretty unique. And I tried to deal with things that you'd be familiar with, things that you could remember, things that were kind of diverse enough from each other that you could distinguish them from each other. So, The desert. If anybody misses this one, I think I will fail you as a course. Predominant vegetation, cacti, but there's other things. That was just the one thing I could think of that would be good to put down. Location, tropics of Capricorn, Cancer. They're north and south of the equator. Usually you find these in the middle of countries. You don't find them right along the coastal regions, as a rule. The outback in Australia is in the middle of the country. The Sahara Desert in northern Africa is more in the middle of the northern part of Africa. Ours, not so much in the middle of the country, but it's definitely not along the coast either. Temperature hot, rainfall less than 30 centimeters per year.
That's what I was like. Is there a lot of natural cactuses out here?
In this immediate area, not so much, but if you start moving up the side, you find more.
Okay, because like you see cactus here, but a lot of people put it
Most
here.
of it's been transplanted, especially like the big saguaro cactuses that stand like this.
Yeah.
You find those around Tucson. That's where I think the Saguaro National Forest, where you see tons of these cacti.
Okay.
And yeah, anything, like whatever you can see with Joshua tree, that's more native, like the choyas, things like that. They're
Okay.
native here.
But not in the like lower desert.
Not so much in the lower.
Okay.
I mean, creosote, I could put that down, I guess. It's kind of
Yeah.
boring enough. We'll talk about the creosote though, next chapter. Chaparral, I'm sorry, if you don't like snakes, be careful. Next slide has a snake. Predominant vegetation, dense, spiny evergreen shrubs. Location, south, the Tropic of Capricorn, north, the Tropic of Cancer. Temperature, hot summers, mild winters, 25 to 45 centimeters per year. If you go towards the coast from here, you make it over the mountains, you find a lot of chaparral along the coast. In the area in and around the safari park in Escondido, all that's chaparral there. In fact, they've set aside the majority of the land as natural native habitat. California king snake is an example of an organism that lives there. I had a class once where a girl told me she didn't like snakes. And I was really good about telling her when snakes would come up, and I forgot her name. First time I ever heard a student scream in class. She really did not like snakes. So shrubs would be the predominant vegetation here. Hot summers, mild winters. I don't think I mentioned anything about winters anywhere else. 25 to 45 centimeters per year, more than the desert, but still not a lot. Coniferous forests, something named after the trees in the region. The conifers, which is predominant vegetation. Location north of the Tropic of Cancer. Temperature cool. Rainfall 39 to 75 centimeters per year. So you can kind of maybe already distinguish in your mind the differences between these. Only got one left.
Professor Rosick, during the test, will you kind of stress that like north of Cancer thing?
That won't be the only thing I stress. I'll give you all the characteristics.
Okay. All right.
Like what biome would consist largely of conifers down north of the Tropic of Cancer, tends to have cooler temperatures and a rainfall of 39 to 75 centimeters per year. You have to tell me which one it is.
Okay. All right. It wouldn't be like north, south, east, west.
I'm not going to say anything more than what I give you.
Okay.
So there's it here, and they're pretty specific as to distinguishing. Like I said, for the tropical rainforest, the amount of rainfall, and it's equatorial. You don't see anything else that's been equatorial again.
Okay.
So if this trips you up a little bit with location, if you're not good with directions or maps or anything like that,
Oh, fine.
focus on the other things.
Okay.
You wouldn't put like south of tropical Cancer and then put none of the above.
No, not for that. Last one is the tundra. Predominant vegetation, grasses, mosses, lichens. Location, Arctic Circle, temperature, cold. Check out the amount of rainfall. Like I said, the desert's not the driest place, it's the tundra. And you're probably sitting there thinking, wait a second, I've seen tons of pictures of the Arctic Circle, of tundras and things like that. They always have snow and ice on the ground. That snow and ice has been there for a long time. It doesn't melt. At least not that much. So 5 to 25 centimeters per year is all they get. So we are not the driest. The tundra is actually the driest. I don't know. I know we're behind schedule. The state of California behind schedule, which is ironic because the East Coast is doing way too much. It'd be nice if we could kind of balance that out. I think we've only got a couple centimeters of that already.
Huh? Daisy.
Here's the last slide. After this, I've got your quizzes from last Thursday. Okay, so it's back today. So don't get up and leave yet. Stratification of terrestrial biomes. We've talked about stratification of water, so why not terrestrial biomes? Now, this isn't going to apply to every biome. Like, this doesn't apply to a desert. It's not going to necessarily apply to coniferous forests or tundras. But if you talk about forests, especially tropical rainforests, this is what you would find. You've got the emergent layer. That's the tallest trees emerging from the rest of the canopy. The canopy layer where you're going to find most of your vegetation. And you've got the understory, things that can grow in maybe less amount of sunlight in the shade of these plants. The immature layer, the lower down you go, the more shade tolerant they have to be. They have to be able to grow in shade in order to survive. The immature layer, and then the very bottom of the ground, the herb layer. So I could give you something like this, have you label arts.
Herb layer, immature layer, understory layer.